Three, two, one.
Let's do it. It's go time.
All right. Welcome, one and all. Today, we have a special guest that is joining us to talk about scale stuff. But before I introduce him, I want to acknowledge my co-host who decided to join me, last minute, and I welcome him very much. John, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Johnny.
And so today's guest is Mr. Nishant Roy. He's an engineering manager over at Pinterest, and Pinterest deals with a lot of scale, as you would imagine. There's a lot going on over there, and we figured, hey, why don't we bring Nishant over and talk about some of these things, and obviously talk about the role Go plays in the mix, right? But obviously, I have to warn you, this is not going to be all about Go kind of podcast. Obviously, Go plays a role in the kind of engineering they're doing over there. But obviously, our conversation is gonna be a bit broad as far as things like CI and CD and pipelines and dealing with that kind of scale is concerned, and hopefully that'll be of interest to a lot of you out there who may be in a similar situation. So Nishant, why don't you give us a brief intro, and before we get into it, what brought you to Pinterest, and what are you doing over there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Johnny. Nice to meet you, John and Johnny as well. And everyone on the stream. So yeah, I'm Nishant. I've been at Pinterest for just under 5 years now. I lead the ad serving platform team here. Started out as an intern, actually, close to 6 years ago now. On the same team. Team at that point was just about 10 people. My team itself now is 15. So talking about scale, the team has scaled tremendously as well with the product and everything around us. What brought me to Pinterest is actually a little different than what I'd say most people's answers are. I met some of the team on campus at Georgia Tech while they were there recruiting. And I really enjoyed talking to both the recruiting team as well as some of the engineers and product managers who were there. As people, they seem like people I would love to work with and hang around with. And also just the problems they were talking about at that point. This is like late 2016 when I met them for my internship. Pinterest was just sort of entering, I think, this hyper growth phase from both a user perspective and a revenue and monetization perspective. So it just seemed like a really interesting place to go. And I mean, coming out as a new grad of college, didn't really know a whole lot. So I figured it would be a good place to take what I did know, learn a lot more from those folks, and see what a company going through that sort of hyper growth period does look like.
Awesome. So you've been there for quite a while. So you had a chance to sort of see the organization, the engineering organization, at least your part of it, sort of mature and grow as
Mhm.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, and the big change I think was obviously going from a pre-IPO company to going public,
Mhm.
and seeing how various things change around that, from not only from day-to-day engineering work, but also communications that go out within the company, outside the company. It definitely did really impact how we operate as an engineering org, I think. The
Mhm.
biggest thing, obviously, as once you're public, there's a lot more compliance that you have to go through, and being on the ad side of that, we deal with that pretty frequently.
Okay. So on sort of the life of an engineer, sort of day to day at Pinterest, working in your group looks like what, generally speaking?
Yeah. So back when I started, again, the team was much smaller. The overall ads organization was much smaller, so things were moving a lot faster. We had less checks in place for things like, we're going to talk about scale and CI/CD today. We didn't have as robust a system as we did today. People were able to make changes a lot faster. However, that came at the cost of a lack of proper verification in place. So we had a much faster feedback loop in one sense, that you were able to get changes out to production faster. However, the piece of feedback that was missing was, is my change actually going to bring down production or cause any major issues?
Mhm.
It was not completely missing, but it was definitely less sophisticated than it is today. So at that point, there was less process. Essentially, if you had your own idea, go write the code. You essentially just needed one person to sign off on the code review. Less sort of compliance and blocking reviews at that time. Go ahead, put your change out, present your metrics, your experiment, your A/B results essentially to your team leader, your org leader, and as long as you get approval from a couple of people, you were good to go. So that was sort of what day in the life looked like back then. Now there's a lot more process. Not necessarily a bad thing. I know process has a
Mhm.
pretty negative connotation, but when it
Mhm.
means we have way fewer severe incidents at least, and that means more people at the org have an understanding and a say in what changes are going out and what reason they're going out for. So essentially, like I mentioned earlier, you just wrote out this doc with your results and got approval from a few folks, and you were good to go. Now, essentially, there's a more robust and involved process to get where there's a forum that comes together to review the changes, and there's healthy debate around why a certain decision is being made and what the rationale for that is. Um, and ensuring that everyone from different end orgs and the product side are on board before any major changes like that go out that may impact pinners, us internally, or our partners or advertisers.
Okay. I imagine that some changes require sort of a, more scrutiny than others, right? So if it's a quick,
Definitely.
bug fix, and you probably don't go through that same extensive process every time, right?
Yes. So we have a more lightweight process for smaller bug fixes, et cetera. And as the sort of criteria for that essentially is as long as there's not a significant change to any of the, 10 to 15 top line metrics that the org has decided are vital to monitor. That
Mhm.
change requires sort of the old process. Essentially, you get approval from one or two folks within your team or your org, and then you're good to go.
Okay. So part of sort of being able to sort of deliver changes, right, big or small, is having some sort of a integration and delivery pipeline, right?
Hmm.
So so it's the same process, I would assume, right? Whether the change is small or big, you're going through the same from a technology standpoint, from an automated process standpoint. It's the same thing. There's no different
Right.
way of doing things if it's a small change, or a different way if it's a big thing.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. So with that said, like what are sort of the stages, right, of this pipeline? So I'm thinking, generally speaking, most people only really have sort of they do their unit tests locally, and there might be some integration tests that happen, in the cloud.
Hmm.
And maybe there's a staging environment involved, right? That's kind of,
Yep.
for most people, that's sufficient, right? So
Hmm.
what are the different stages in your pipeline, and why do you have all those different stages?
Yeah, and I'm happy to say that this is something that's evolved a lot as we've scaled as well. So just backing up again to what I do as part of leading the ad serving platform team, our responsibilities are to enable the ads team to continue to grow and deliver and launch more products, new algorithms to improve ad delivery efficiency on the platform. We're over a $2 billion company now that all comes from ads, so that's part of what we do. The other side of that obviously is again going back to scale and compliance, making sure that our systems are scaling at a ideally sublinear cost rate. So for every dollar spent, we don't necessarily want to be for every dollar made, we don't want to be spending an additional dollar. That's one condition. And also, as the number of engineers grows and the number of changes grow in our system, we don't want to be having as many or as frequent or as severe outages at the very least. So given that those requirements, having a robust CI/CD system, integration testing, staging environment, et cetera, incremental rollout became extremely important. So what this was like when I joined Pinterest was I'm proud to say that the ads team was one of the first teams to have a continuous deployment process. So there was pretty good foundation for me to build on top of. Essentially, when you committed your change within, let's say, the next 30 minutes, it would hit a Canary environment. That Canary environment was essentially just, let's say, one host. And the goal of that host was to ensure, and this is a Go service. So the goal of that host was to just make sure that your service is not panicking and crashing. If it did, it would trigger an alert to an on-caller who would then go in, look at the cause for the panic, roll back the change, ensure that it doesn't go out to further stages, etc. Once it passed that initial canary test, which is just about a 10 to 15-minute test, it would go out to a what we call the staging, but let's say like a larger canary essentially, which was at that point, let's say about 1% of the cluster and of the entire production cluster. This is all serving production traffic. So now on this 1% of the cluster, we can actually monitor more application level metrics, whether that is number of ads inserted, CPU usage, memory usage, disk usage, etc. At that point, I want to say we were monitoring probably about 70 to 80 metrics. Um, if any of those metrics showed a significant regression and we could tune the thresholds for each of those alerts, it would trigger similarly an alert to our teams on caller, who would have to go in and manually pause deploys and the whole process of debugging from there on forth. What we've evolved a lot since is we no longer require the on-caller to go manually pause deploys or rollback deploys. We have a system in place. It's built on top of Spinnaker, which is an open source platform, if I remember correctly. Essentially, your CD pipeline will automatically pause a deploy if any of those metrics show a significant regression. So that was a big win because one, to reduce the stress on our on-callers, two, to actually reduce the number of incidents that could have just prevented by someone going in and clicking the button at the right time. Besides that, what we built in, you mentioned integration testing and the fact that some people, sometimes will run some local testing, then push out their changes and wait for feedback in production. We realized that was actually one really big gap because there was no great way of enforcing that people were actually running that local test. Because that essentially required the code reviewer to follow up and ensure that sufficient testing was performed. And again, like you said, depending on whether it's a small change or a large change, the burden on the reviewer changes based on that as well. So we wanted something more uniform that applies to every single change, every single code change, runs in a reasonable amount of time, doesn't require developers to be sitting there for an hour while their tests run, and gives us reasonable confidence that if this change goes out, we're not saying that it's definitely not going to cause an outage, but at least we're not going to have a significant outage that's going to bring down the service, bring down the site, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing we built is what we call a pre-submit test. That was actually one of my first projects when I joined the company. Essentially, every request that comes into Pinterest, we log a sample of that, or every request that comes into the ad system, rather, we log a certain sample of that to a Kafka topic. And then when we want to run this online integration test, essentially every time you put up a new PR, we package your changes similar to how we would for a production build. Package your changes, create an artifact that this pre-submit test framework then deploys for you to a couple of test hosts. Sends this, so now that we have that log traffic, we can essentially tail that Kafka log, get some number of requests, send them to these hosts, simulating production traffic without actually affecting any users. That host then emits its own set of metrics. We can essentially grab those metrics, compare them against a production cluster, or at least a different host that is running the latest version of your main branch. See if there's any significant regression, and obviously we loosen the thresholds for that because we're only running this test for anywhere from like 3 to 10 minutes. And if there is a regression, then your commit is essentially blocked from landing before until you resolve those discrepancies. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure, and I think we successfully achieved this, that this test is able to run in less than 10 to 15 minutes, because one of the great parts of Go and our relatively smaller code base at that point was that our entire repository, our entire service at least, was able to build an artifact in about, I want to say 4 to 5 minutes. So if we suddenly introduced this test that ran for 30 minutes, developers would have hated us, saying, our developer speed just went up almost 10x. So that was one of the things that we wanted to guarantee, is that this test essentially ran in 10 minutes. You did not need to wait for more than 10 minutes for all your Jenkins builds, your unit tests to pass, and for this integration test to pass before you were able to land your change. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those were the two key parts that came out, was this pre-submit integration testing, which allowed us to actually define which metrics need to be monitored. And then secondly was this automated canary analysis, essentially, which is, I think, an industry-wide practice at this point, but that really saved us a lot of headache of manual process and reduced the stress on our on-callers. And on top of that, we've now seen a lot of teams actually adopting these frameworks to add in their own metrics. So for instance, I mentioned earlier, when we had the sort of continuous deploy process in the early days, we monitored about 70 to 80 metrics. That number now, I haven't looked at it lately, but is anywhere between 500 to 700 metrics now, which obviously doesn't come all from the infra team. It comes from a lot of product teams and machine learning teams being able to onboard their own metrics and have the confidence that these metrics are A, stable enough, B, actually protecting our systems. Similarly with the pre-submit tests themselves, when we first rolled it out, the infra team just configured 10 metrics, I think, which were mainly system performance related. Now we're up to about 90 metrics added by all sorts of product and quality teams to ensure that their particular slice of the ads pie doesn't go down. So for instance, we could even do it to the granularity of checking the number of ads inserted for simulated dark users coming from Canada or Japan or something like that. We would obviously have to increase our sample size to get a meaningful number there, but this framework gives you that level of flexibility, which was widely adopted and has really helped us a lot.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're kind of testing in production, pretty much.
Yes and no. So our the ACA, the automatic canary analysis, is happening in production. Our
Mhm.
pre-submit testing is not happening in production. It's
Okay.
essentially replicating production traffic and sending it to a couple of dark set of hosts, which is not actually serving any actual user traffic.
Okay, so you're simulating what would have happened had
Mhm.
it been hit by the actual traffic. So I'm assuming that traffic is basically was captured from production, actual production environments, and then you just basically replay it against that canary.
That's right. We essentially just log 1% of all production traffic to a Kafka topic, keep it
Okay.
around for about 2 or 3 days, and that's constantly being refreshed. We can constantly use that to replay and simulate what would happen, like you said, if that binary was being served to production users.
So when people think about testing, I think a lot of time the first thing that pops in their head is like unit tests and these smaller things that happen offline. Would you say that, excuse me, introducing all of this stuff has caused them to, or developers to, like focus less on that and focus because you have these like basically production or production simulated types tests that are at least a lot more realistic sounding? So would you say that like the unit tests get a little bit less focused then, or how does that sort of change the dynamic?
A little bit, yes. When we first rolled it out, especially in the first couple of years, we did see that. I mean, I personally saw a lot of PRs coming in where folks were just like, "Hey, pre-submit tests passed. I'm not going to write unit tests for this." And to be honest, I mean, that was not the worst thing in the world for developer velocity to some extent. Like, you're guaranteed, or you have a fairly high rate of confidence that your change is safe. So why take that extra time to write unit tests when you might be doing something, writing a new feature instead? We did, however, I'm trying to think of a few examples. I'll come back to you I'll get back to you if they come to me. But there were a few instances where things sort of did pass through our pre-submit test framework, likely because they weren't impacting something top line, but something perhaps offline. For instance, if we didn't have proper validation of the data that was being logged for whether that's offline analysis or machine learning training jobs or billing and reporting pipelines, all that sort of stuff. Um, those were things that may not necessarily be monitored by this framework, since at the start, like I said, it was mostly just monitoring ad insertions and things like that. Um, so we did sort of realize that while this is great, it's not sufficient, and we do need at least some baseline level of test coverage, or at least local integration testing, to capture those things as well.
So seeing what you're doing now and seeing how it works, this, at least from my perspective, this sounds like something where at scale, this approach works very well. But if you were just starting up from like a smaller business or something, this is one of those cases where if you tried to mimic what a big company was doing, it wouldn't work at all because you just don't have the volume or scale to like, if you're only getting 100 web requests a day, you can't trust your production in 1% of your servers to actually give you any real information. So would you say that this is definitely one of those cases where as your company gets bigger, the approaches you can use sort of change and adapt based on your circumstances?
Completely. Like you said, if you don't have a large enough sample size, this sort of testing is not really going to give you meaningful results. It's just going to be kind of a coin flip at that point, whether your test passes or fails. So having those more deterministic unit tests that actually test the behavior on one single request is a lot more important at an early stage.
You mentioned or rather, you haven't mentioned what you're using for your observability stack. So a lot of things are being captured, metrics, your team are adding things based on features or products. Like, how is this something homegrown, or are you using off-the-shelf software to provide that observability?
Yeah, so for general observability at Pinterest, metrics are essentially stored in an OpenTSDB backend, and we have an internal tool that is called StatsBoard. I believe there's a blog post about it. If not, I'm sure there will be at some point. It's a super great team. It's one of my favorite teams to work with. StatsBoard is essentially very much like Prometheus. I haven't used Prometheus a lot myself, but just a UI to visualize metrics, time series metrics. It also allows you the ability to define alerts based on different thresholds, etc. And that's what we're using for observability at a company-wide scale. For pre-submit test specifically, we had a slightly more custom solution because we didn't want to go through the whole hassle of essentially, since I mentioned the way we were doing it is every binary or every PR that we packaged into a deployable binary for testing would get deployed to a single host or just one or two hosts. So we needed a better way of essentially isolating metrics for those two hosts rather than needing to go through this UI and filtering for those two host names in particular to get the right set of metrics. So for those hosts, we used essentially the EXPVAR library from the Go standard library to expose all metrics through an HTTP endpoint. Essentially, we could then scrape that endpoint, get all the metrics that were generated on that host as one large JSON blob, essentially. Parse those in our pre-submit test framework and use that for the actual metric regression analysis.
Very cool.
Mhm.
So how much of your stack is Go-based services?
Only the ads team uses Go heavily for online serving. So the ad delivery and ad logging systems are in Go. Pinterest broadly is more a Python, Java, and C++ based infrastructure. So our front user-facing API is in Python. A lot of our backends are in Java, unless there's like low latency, high performance requirements, in which case they're in C++. The ads team, I don't know the historical reason for this. This happened like 7-8 years ago, so like 3 years before I joined. But my understanding is there was a couple of things. I think we realized that the ad stack needed to be pretty low latency, but also required pretty high developer velocity. So that was essentially my understanding is the team was debating between Java versus C++. Java had its latency concerns at that point. Garbage collection wasn't as advanced as it is today. C++ had developer velocity concerns at that point, and I think we had a couple folks on the team at that point who felt very strongly about Go. And again, John, like you mentioned, things happen differently in an early stage company versus when you're later. So 2013, 2014, Pinterest was probably like 4 to 5 years old, I want to say. I don't think we had as refined a process for choosing the frameworks and languages we develop in as we do now. So that's kind of how it happened, and we arrived at using Go. And it's been pretty great. I think we've for the longest time have hit the happy middle ground between developer velocity and performance. I think Johnny, when we met at the Baltimore Go meetup, we talked a little bit about the challenge we faced with Go efficiency as well on the garbage collection side. And more recently, I've been hearing through the Go Enterprise Advisory Board that this is becoming more of a known concern for large scale companies. And the Go team has put out a few flags recently to allow you to better tune the garbage collector. So in Go 19, for instance, I think most recently they added the ability to tune your soft memory limit as opposed to tuning just the Go GC value, which I think is a great way of allowing developers to essentially better control the impact of garbage collection on their systems. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I think Uber last year or so put out a blog post about how they dynamically tune the Go GC environment variable itself based on system metrics, which worked really well for them. I think if I remember correctly, they saved millions of dollars in cloud infra costs, but it's a little hacky. It's not the ideal way that we want to be managing our infra. So I'm glad that the Go team is always listening to those concerns and putting out new features to make it easier.
Right, adding some official tooling for tweaking the garbage collection process.
Exactly.
The Java world is sort of notorious for all the sort of the flags and optimizations and all the bells and whistles, all the buttons you have access to for GC tuning, and so hopefully Go doesn't necessitate that level of customizability. But again, as you say, the fact that the Go team is listening, especially for customers that have basically, if you have to tweak GC settings, then you're dealing at a scale that most people simply aren't, right? It's not often we need to basically tweak what Go does out of the box. So this may not be a concern for a lot of people, right? The vast majority of people, but for those that do need it, it's good to have a non-hacky ways of going about tweaking those things. So that's
exactly cool. Yeah. Spent about 6 months of my life, I think 2 years in, strictly just analyzing how GC was impacting our service and how to improve it. Written a couple of blog posts about that as well. It was really interesting. It was fascinating, but I know now with this new flag, I could have saved at least 4 months of those 6. So here we are.
It's kind of nice that they took their time with it, at least a little bit, because when Go was first released, or you have to imagine, at least in my mind, it's young enough that they didn't have enough customers using Go in high enough production environments that they really had enough data to decide what needs to be done versus what necessarily doesn't. At least that would be my perspective as an outsider. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
So it's nice they've taken their time and they're trying to figure that out as people are using it at scale. But that's something that in my mind, would be very hard to have from the get-go, because it's like trying to optimize a page when you have 10 users for a million users. It's I have no idea what my bottlenecks are actually going to be at that point.
Yep. And the good news is they did have sufficient tooling for you to understand your system usage if needed. That's something that came packaged in from, I guess I don't know how early on, but things like pprof and memstats, et cetera, that allow you to actually understand how your system's performing, analyze that data exactly how you need, understand the bottlenecks in your system. One thing I'd love to see, I think if the Go team is listening, if we can have an official guide on how to use these tools a little more. Maybe some tutorials for people starting out who've never used flame graphs before, who don't understand how profiling works or how to best read it. I think that'd be a really great way to further the adoption of these tools and make it much simpler for everyone to understand how to tune their systems.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting sort of dichotomy, I think, within the Go community right now, because although we've had talks and blog posts and things written on performance tuning and optimization and for Go in general, sort of be it in terms of analyzing allocation, memory usage, how many threads you have running at any given time, like all that tooling sort of exists. But we also tell developers, well, don't worry about premature optimization, right? Which means like don't really look under the hood that much. Don't run pprof and don't analyze basically what your application is doing, because that might be premature optimization, right? Only go looking for these tools if you suspect you have a problem with performance. But at the same time, we end up building things perhaps in a suboptimal way, and that ends up pretty much receiving more traffic than you anticipated. Or maybe you go through a sort of a growth period, kind of like Pinterest did, where once upon a time you were a smaller organization that was not public, and now you are public and you're getting a lot more traffic, right? Those things you don't go back and rewrite some of those things you were earlier on just because you now have more traffic, right? So you end up with this sort of a legacy, sort of built-in sort of performance, sort of suboptimal, right, processes and tooling and services that are doing things that is way more than they were designed to do. Now you kind of have to have a sort of an engineering effort to refactor things. I'm curious if you've experienced sort of this need to go back and change things and refactor things and make things faster, right? And sort of obviously how Go made that easier or harder.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's an impossible decision to make, right? Because on one hand, if you're spending too much time optimizing early on, you're not going to make it as a startup, especially given this environment we're heading into now. Speed of everything is of utmost importance. On the other hand, like you said, you end up with these legacy systems that don't then support either hypergrowth or supporting new products. I think one big thing that we've seen over the last probably 5 years to a decade or so is widespread adoption of video. So folks who didn't really, or companies who didn't really optimize early on for, let's say, content delivery, for instance, suddenly you're delivering video, which is obviously a lot more expensive, and people are having to reconsider how they built those systems, or in some cases even rebuilding those systems to operate at this new scale that customers now want. For us, I think for my team in particular, the biggest scale challenge we were going through was the team growing. So like I said, my team specifically was 10 people now. Now the entire ads infrastructure org is probably getting close to about 100. The ads team is probably 3 to 4 times that number. So how can we, our sort of the question we were asking ourselves is, now that we're going through this phase of growth, building a lot more products for a lot more users, for a lot more partners, how can we continue to keep that same level of velocity that our pinners are used to, our partners are used to, and us as engineers are used to, with this growing org, without causing more incidents or without having people sort of stepping on each other's toes? And I think that is, to some extent, in the eternal quest. We're never going to really hit a perfect, happy, I don't know what the right word is, but middle ground between all three of those factors. But that is something we're constantly evaluating and tuning for, is how do we build our systems in a way, either can we build better modularity? Can we have more config-driven systems where folks can make changes without needing to understand how the rest of the system works? So for instance, for rolling out new experimental models, do I need to actually go and read exactly how those models are going to be chosen? Do I need to understand what features are being fed into my model? Do I need to understand how those scores are then used? Or can I just go in and make a simple, JSON change or something and say, for this, subset of traffic, which may be country or surface or device, for iPhone users coming from Canada on, the search page, I want you to use this model with this percentage of traffic, and I don't care how the rest of the system works. So those are sort of the things that have been really on our minds constantly, and something we're looking to continuously improving. So in fact, the pre-submit test framework was one way that we did that. Is anyone can go and make a config change to add a new metric and add a new slice without affecting how any of the rest of the system works. Our actual ads delivery system isn't fully there yet. We're continuing to improve this for developers, making it easier for them to make changes, A, without bringing down the system, B, without blocking other folks or needing to understand how your change interacts with someone else's. But like I said, it's the eternal quest. As the product offerings from the sales side and the product teams get more and more diverse, we realized that some parts of our system just weren't built to support those sort of products in mind. Something as simple as if we need to serve, these are some of the problems that we've solved perhaps, but like if we need to serve both video and image ads for the same request, do we have a good way of doing that? Not a particularly hard thing if you're building a system from scratch, obviously, but once you've built it with a certain assumption, just these basic things sort of start to fall apart. And then you need to go and look into, should I just be redesigning this whole thing? Or is there a quick and easy way for me to get this off the ground and then go in and sort of redo it to unblock the next big thing? And again, what ends up typically happening, I think this is probably true for most big companies, is you obviously need to get that MVP out. So you do something a little hacky to start out with, and then you retroactively go in and ensure that A, it's not going to break anything, and B, how do we make this a more pleasant experience for developers and product managers alike. So we're just sort of, that's the wheel that's always spinning, and we're trying to stay ahead of it, but we're usually playing catch up.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I was going to ask, Johnny had asked you about like existing services where you didn't take all that stuff into consideration. Do you find yourself now when you're building something new that you actually look at things like flame graphs and garbage collection and like try to optimize those things up front now that you know you're at the scale where that stuff actually matters?
Yes, and the reason it's become a lot easier is because our amazing infra team, Pinterest wide, has actually provided better tooling for us to do those things more automatically out of the box. So rather than us needing to write a manual script to go run a profile in our Go system, we essentially have a central system now that we can essentially enable profiling through. So I think those are the sort of investments, once again, that when the company hits a certain critical mass and we have a team that we can afford to invest in building tools like that, becomes a lot easier. But till that point, I'd say no. Till we had this company-wide tool, it was still up to us as the ads infra org owning our own services to decide when and where we needed to do this. And honestly, a large part of it was driven in a voluntary manner. Folks who were interested in thinking about performance and saving in infra cost, saving in latency, would sort of just on their own time go and run these profiles and identify hotspots. Alternatively, if we hit certain system limitations, so let's say modeling team X wants to launch this new model that is suddenly a lot more expensive, or expensive in terms of either dollars or milliseconds of system latency that could be affecting the end user experience. It's only at that point that we would then go in and look at, okay, you want to add 50 milliseconds of latency to the end-to-end system. We only have 120 total. Can we save this somewhere else, or can we optimize your system or your requests in a way that brings that number down to minimize pinner impact? But this is something that we're now looking for to be more proactive about.
Did you suffer from, like, during this growth phase, did you suffer from sort of team silos, right? Basically a team having to do, out of necessity, right? Having to do, create their own tooling, adopt their own sort of ways of doing things. And then now trying to do this, company wide, right? Having to sort of disentangle teams from the way they know how to do things because they built things, from scratch, or they bought something and have been using it. How challenging was that to sort of rise up to a common sort of level of tooling for everybody?
Yeah, to some extent. So definitely for us being on the ads team, like I said, we were the only major online service in Go at that point. So we were definitely building our own tools. We owned our own deploy systems, our own testing systems, etc. So there has been a divergence there in how different teams on ads versus non-ads do things. Within ads itself, I think one thing we saw is that because of a lack of that centralized framework from our side, from the ad serving infra side, different teams sort of built their own products, even within the ad stack. They wrote their own code, and that caused a divergence in a few different ways. So the code quality is not always, at the mark that we would like it to be. There's not exactly the same level of test coverage everywhere, or things might just be done differently. So for something as simple as if we're sending batch requests to a different service, a data backend or a model inference backend, that logic might be implemented differently by different teams, which then makes it really hard when those folks leave, when things break, go in and understand exactly what broke and why. So one thing we're trying to really do as the ads infra team now is standardize those frameworks and tools for at least all the different ads product teams to use. So going back to batching as an example, my former manager just essentially took one day and wrote a library that made it really easy to run things in batches in Go. So taking away the requirement, not the ability, taking away the requirement for engineers to understand how Go routines work, and do so in a way that is thread safe. So building that batching library essentially allowed them to use this interface and be guaranteed that there was proper panic recovery. There was essentially an easier way to enable locks if needed, and you didn't need to write your own your concurrency code yourself. Things like that have really helped standardize practices across the different verticals on ads itself and make it much easier for us to maintain and grow the system going forward.
Mhm. How do you record and communicate infrastructure decisions within your teams or even to broader teams, other teams that might learn from them?
That's a great question. Overall, Pinterest now has a much better standardized documentation template for these large new services or new changes that are being rolled out, and all of that information is essentially saved permanently on our internal drives, etc. For sort of smaller things, so if my team were to go change how we do a certain thing in the ad stack, I think there's a couple different ways. There's no good central place, I'd say, where you can go and find all the large infra decisions, most likely. What we do is we have a production readiness forum essentially within ads itself. So that involves some senior leadership from the ads team, help from the SRE org, and then representatives from the various infra teams who will essentially evaluate your change. So you're required to come prepared to this meeting with what you're changing, what the stack of your change is, what are the critical metrics that you're monitoring, what services might you be affecting, what failure scenarios do you foresee, what are the mitigation strategies, etc. And then that 1 hour meeting for production readiness essentially becomes a forum where everyone can sort of test you to some extent, and test your plan to see whether your change is, at least do you have enough of a plan in mind to make sure your change is safe to go out in production. And then that becomes a way to make enough people aware of these large decisions that sort of worked well for us so far. The gap there is obviously when in an environment where all those folks suddenly leave at a similar period of time. Hopefully that doesn't happen. It would require someone to go in and read those production readiness documents again to understand the reasoning behind everything.
Mm-hmm.
For larger sort of product launches, we have an email alias within the company where essentially every time you want to launch an ads experiment that is moving some significant top line metrics, you need to send out an email to this alias before you get launch approval. And at least that serves as providing everyone in the monetization org some visibility into the changes that were made and why. Those emails are then further linked to very, very detailed, like 50 to 100 page long documents in some cases, going through all the various steps of analysis that went into it. They're usually about 15 to 20, but I just saw one that was like 93. It's mostly just graphs and tables, but still. So all that knowledge is recorded somewhere. It's just, I think what's worked well is probably this behavior of just publicizing it to everyone once the decision is going out, so that even if the top 10% of the leadership team leaves, there's probably at least enough people who know where to find the rationale behind the decision. So I assume that's what's worked pretty well.
What does an environment like this look like for a junior developer, right? So if you're looking to make impact, right, and within this system, which by on its face seems very intimidating, right? If you're not familiar with any such process, right? So maybe you're out of school, maybe you've only spent a couple of years in industry, and here you are faced with this sort of process, right? How do you shepherd a more junior member of the team right through this? How do you go about that?
Yeah, so having been there myself, one thing that worked really well for me, and I encourage a lot of folks to do this within Pinterest and at other companies, is biggest opportunity you have for understanding gaps in the system, whether that's performance related or stability related, especially, are incidents. So getting involved
Mm,
when there's an incident, you don't actually have to do anything. You just see that something's broken. You join the channel or the Google Meet or whatever it is where that issue is being discussed. Just sit there quietly, listen to what people are saying. They're going to talk about the system. After the incident is done, someone's going to write up a very detailed description of how is the system expected to work, why did it not work that way, and what are we going to do about it. Saying that is one of the most valuable sources of knowledge because it's usually the system owner or an expert on the system doing that piece, and that shows you like what the gaps are, and that I think benefits you in two ways. So in terms of impact and to some extent visibility, certain issues reoccur. And even though we have remediation tasks to make sure that issues don't reoccur, some things just happen over and over again. So I about 6 months ago saw an incident on the ad side that I remember happening 4.5 years ago when I was had been here only like 6 or 7 months. So when I saw some of those metrics, it just sort of jogged my memory. It's like, hey, this happened a long time ago, but happened before. Let me just go in and see what we did that time, and we can try and redo that and see if it works. So I've seen that work for several folks who are new to the company. It's like, hey, I saw this happen 2 weeks ago. Here's what Nishant did to fix it that time. Let's try this again. And then suddenly you're the hero that saved the day. Um, and even if that's not necessarily what happens, as part of the follow-ups, taking on some of those remediation items is often something that is not, glorious work necessarily, but can sometimes have really big payoffs. It's like I made this one change that prevented, a malicious user request or a bad user request or any corrupt data from bringing the system down for the rest of time, potentially, right?
mhm.
Um, and that teaches you a lot about understanding faults in the system, understanding how we analyze those faults in the system, and how to plug those gaps. So I'd say that's probably one of the easiest ways if you have absolutely no knowledge of a system, just get into these rooms with people who are discussing everything about the system and
Mhm.
hypothesizing about all the reasons why something might break. It's just one of the quickest ways to learn a lot about different parts of the company's tech stack.
And if you have a suggestion, big or small, right? Do you usually pair up with somebody more senior who can help you through sort of the vetting process?
Yeah, so for my team, and I think a lot of teams at Pinterest, usually everyone new, especially, is assigned an onboarding mentor who's typically a more senior person on the team. So that's usually a good sounding board to start with. Like, hey, I have this idea. What do you think? For my team specifically, we have a biweekly team meeting where essentially for 20 minutes every 2 weeks, everyone is encouraged to. There's other part of that meeting. It's an hour-long meeting, but in these 20 minutes, it's like open floor. Just share anything that you found interesting, any problem that you faced, or any question that you have. So I saw this thing happen. I have no idea how this works, the way it works. One example for me early on was understanding how the RPC library in Go works. For instance, it's a little bit of magic how those functions get registered. So bringing those questions up and giving people the opportunity to get answers to those questions, and just bringing up those suggestions and how they can improve systems, team processes, etc., has worked really well for us to essentially get visibility and get answers.
Awesome. John, you got anything before we switch it over to unpopular opinions? Because Nishant said he brought the heat, so I'm looking forward.
Nothing else comes to mind. I'm ready to hear this unpopular opinion.
Nice, nice.
Well, with this pod, this might actually be really popular.
I actually think you should probably leave.
It's so rude when the host cuts off the guest.
I mean, luckily in post, they'll just cut him out.
They'll
You'll
just
be
cut.
Perfect.
All right, awesome. All right, let's hear it, Nishant.
This might actually be a really popular opinion for this pod, but my unpopular opinion is that working with non-type languages, non-compiled languages, can be a nightmare, especially as your code base grows extremely large. I will say, shout out to the Pinterest team. I think they've done a fantastic job of making our Pythonic API easy to work with, easy to read, great documentation, great testing. However, if I just want to go in and read one bit of the code, it's really hard to understand exactly how it works because I don't know, for lack of typing, I don't know what's going into this function unless things are really well named,
Mm-hmm.
which at this scale becomes hard to enforce, becomes a little hard to test. You really need solid unit tests for it, everything down to like input parameter validation, which is something you don't need in a type language.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it becomes really easy to like accidentally introduce some bugs. So I know for a fact that one of my friends in the past who worked at Pinterest introduced one bug where they accidentally reused a variable that was defined elsewhere, overrode that variable's name because this file was like 900 lines long and Python didn't throw up any flags for using this variable like Go would. And it essentially caused not going to go into what the issue is, but it caused an issue with the content users were seeing. So, and that's something we didn't realize till the change went out and was live for a few days. I mean, it was restricted to internal employees only, but essentially it was something that I know that Go would have saved us like 3 days of wasted time, essentially. So that is my unpopular opinion. Industry-wide, may not be an unpopular opinion for folks listening to this pod, or with you too.
Go ahead, John. What do you think?
I mean, I feel like what he's saying has a lot of truth. What makes those languages great at small scale also makes them challenging at large scale.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I would assume most people getting into those things kind of understand those trade-offs. But I don't know. Maybe some people completely disagree.
I mean, my opinion is that there's always going to be somebody who has who is of a different opinion. But I think opinions, and perhaps, well, this is not an unpopular opinion, but I think opinions should be allowed to change over time, right? So if you were, once upon a time, I was a diehard, statically typed language person. Then I discovered, dynamic typing. I'm like, oh man, Ruby's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Python is awesome, blah blah, right? And then I swing back around. Now I'm like a Go diehard because I know what my types are and I know what to expect in places. So I think it's okay to sort of swing back and forth. But I think the better approach, which is I think harder than most people give it credit, is to have a measured approach, right? To how you make decisions about things, so just how you sort of judge things to be good or bad. There's no such thing as absolutely good or absolutely bad, right? So you kind of have to say, okay, well, what problem am I solving, right? And so today I might use dynamic typing because I'm able to move a little faster because maybe I'm building a prototype, maybe I'm building something that doesn't need to be statically typed for reason X, Y, and Z, and what the decision is, which is why I love decision records, right? Including why you pick a framework or why you pick a language or what velocity you think you're going to gain from having made these decisions, right? Because if you look back, right, 3 months, 6 months, 6 years from now, and look at, okay, this is why this decision or these decisions were made. This is why we picked Rust. This is why we picked, Lua. This is why whatever, right? And you can explain, you can provide the context within which you were making that decision, the information you had at the time, right? Then I think it's perfectly fine to argue for and make the case for using anything you want to use, right? As long as you have the rationale for it and your teammates at the time understand what your reasoning is and they're behind it, right? So the disservice we do ourselves is by basically being fanatics of one thing. And I know sometimes I myself sound like a Go fanatic, right? Because I love Go. I do it every day. It's my favorite language. And hopefully I'll be writing Go, into my retirement, right? But I know that Go is not always the right tool for the job. So I have to sort of check myself, right? Whenever I see somebody coming in with a Ruby or Java, whatever it is, to not say, oh, we don't want to use those languages because they're not Go, right? That kind of sort of ego, I think, should be left out of technology decision making, because technology is all about trade-offs, and you're going to experience trade-offs, whether it be a language or framework, software you buy off the shelf or software you build yourself, how you run your software, how you build your infrastructure. Everything is a trade-off, right? So I think we have to be more sort of gracious with our teammates who may like something different than us, and we have to be sort of level-headed, right? And and understand that there's context for every decision made.
I mean, I can definitely agree with that. Like, there's always
Yeah.
trade-offs with all that stuff. And like, it's also interesting as Nishant was talking about it. I guess I was also thinking about the fact that depending on when you join a project, I think can sometimes skew your opinion of whether something's more complicated. Like, if I'm working on a Ruby project that I've worked on my entire life, like, like 10 years or something, and I know really well, I don't find it very complicated, even if it's gotten very large. But that's because I know it
Mhm.
like the back of my hand at that point. But I could completely imagine cases where somebody new coming in, like, I want to make a change, and then looking at it and being like, I have no idea like, it's much trickier. Whereas, like, in that case, I think sometimes a statically typed language like Go is a lot easier to jump into with no context, no idea of what everything does, because it's a lot more explicit. But I mean, I completely agree, Johnny, that generally speaking, as long as there's good reasoning behind whatever you choose, that's not one's better than the other. But I could definitely see the argument at this point being, okay, we're a large company. At this point, it seems like the statically typed ones are more stable. They're easier to bring new developers on. So even if we think it's going to be a little quicker in Python, maybe it makes more sense to use the statically typed language.
Right, and it's so dependent on the stage that you're at. Because tomorrow, if I was starting a company, needed to hire 5 folks, how easy or hard would it be for me to find 5 great Go developers versus 5 great Python developers? It's night and day. I know I can find 5 Python developers probably in a week. Versus Go, one, it's actually harder to evaluate too, right? Like if I want to evaluate how well a person's writing in Go, it's not as easy as like one quick interview. Versus Python's probably a little easier because I know you can, even if you're not well versed in everything, it's going to be easier for you to get started and do 80% of your job and then ramp up on sort of the internals as needed. The question then becomes, what is, or is there ever a right stage for a company going from 10 engineers to 100 engineers to 1,000 engineers? When and if do you decide to go from Python to Java to Go to C++, whatever that is? And is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? And I don't think there's enough data that exists in the industry to like truly answer that question. There's a couple of pieces floating around rewrites essentially not being the best idea in the world always, but I've seen cases where rewrites have actually paid off tremendously. I think Snap rewriting their Android app was one example, right, where it was a tremendous win for them. So it's very dependent. You're right. And Johnny, that was very well said. I do agree with you.
Kind of reminds me of like the discussion around like microservices or anything like that, when people are like, is it the right time to switch to them? And you'll see a million stories online about how it was successful, and other stories where it's like it was the biggest like problem we've ever had because we'd made that switch. So it's like there isn't enough data to really say this is the way you should do it.
Right.
Yep.
But if
So,
you are
John,
starting a new company, I guarantee you can find 10 people who want to learn Go. They might not be experts in
That's
it.
true.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, I think that is way more likely than to find actually fully grown, so to speak, Go developers. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. John, did you bring
Definitely.
on Pop?
I did not. I'm too depressed with the
Fine.
snow outside. I don't,
Maybe that is your unpop. There shouldn't be snow at this time of year for you.
there really shouldn't be snow at this time of the year. It's not even Thanksgiving yet. Come on.
It's not it.
a
Well,
little early.
My wife now wants to get Christmas decorations out. There's snow outside. It's really hard to say no.
Right.
It's basically Christmas once it starts snowing, right? That's how it works.
Sort of.
Just about.
Honestly, the biggest reason why I say no right now is because I'm too busy right now. After Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
it usually dies down a little bit for me. So I'm like, then I can help with Christmas stuff if you need.
Right.
I'm not
Johnny,
trying
how
to
about
ruin
you?
the party.
So I'm gonna get meta for a second here. I think it is okay to not have an opinion about something, and and I say that within the context of this sort of dumpster fire that's happening actively in the Twitterverse, about Twitter itself, right? And there's stuff floating online about the new owner of the organization and their approach to things, and some people didn't like the person to begin with, and this is just adding more validation to existing thoughts about this person. Like I personally, I don't have an opinion one way or the other, and the what I do see, however, is we are taking on this sort of judgmental tone, right? about each other, right? Whether you're for or against, and whether you paid for Twitter Blue, right, or not, or whether you're a fanboy of Mr. Musk or not, or oh, this he's gonna set the world on fire with his anti whatever. Like, you know, to me, at least from where I'm sitting, it's just another Tuesday, right, on the world of the internet and in the world at large. There will always be something out there to yank your chain, to pull you along like a puppet on a string. There will always be something to trigger you. There will always be something, right? Whatever shape it takes, right? So for me, at least for what I'm doing for my own personal mental health, is to learn to not be triggered by all the things all the time, right? So I'm learning to not have an opinion about things. So perhaps that is an unpopular opinion. Perhaps others will feel the same way. I don't care. that's the I don't care. I guess that's the net effect of that for me, right? I don't want to have an opinion about others' opinions.
I think by default that's going to be an unpopular opinion because the only people who are going to speak up on it are the ones who do have an opinion.
Right.
The rest of them are just like,
Self-fulfilling
"I'm not
prophecy,
voting."
right? Right.
Yeah.
Self-fulfilling. Yeah.
I like how this
Indeed.
poll will probably be on Twitter as well. So
Right. Yeah.
chance.
So we'll find out. We'll find out. But in any case, this was a very nice episode. Thank you, Nishant, for coming and talking about sort of the kinds of things you're working on over at Pinterest and sort of the challenges the team has experienced and your role in it. And I hope that I wish you continued success and growth in your endeavor. It was awesome having you. And John, thank you so much for being my co-host last minute. Always good having you. With that, we will say goodbye to the internet. And listener, we will catch you on the next one.
Thanks so much.